Vancouver is Canada's third largest city. Looking carefully at a map of Canada, you'll notice that most major Canadian cities are located in the central region, while Vancouver stands unique as the only major city on the west coast. Vancouver is part of British Columbia, which was originally a British colony. In 1867, when Britain allowed Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia to merge into a self-governing dominion, British Columbia remained a British colony. By 1871, the region had become a financial burden for Britain. The British gave British Columbia two choices: join the United States or join Canada. At the time, the U.S. had already acquired Alaska, so if the U.S. gained British Columbia, they would control almost the entire North American west coast. Canada was far behind the U.S. in both population and economic strength. It seemed the U.S. was determined to acquire British Columbia. However, in 1871, Canada won the competition against the U.S. and gained British Columbia. So how did Canada manage to acquire British Columbia? After new trade routes opened up, European colonizers began a rush to divide up the Americas. By the early 18th century, North America was mainly split between Britain and France, with the French colonies known as New France. In 1756, Britain and France went to war over North American dominance. Britain won and took New France, renaming it Quebec. From then on, Britain's North American colonies were mainly divided into the 13 colonies, Quebec, and several other regions including Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Rupert's Land. The American Revolution broke out in 1775, and the Continental Congress issued a declaration warning the British 13 colonies. The Articles of Confederation offered Quebec a place as the 14th state in the new independent nation, but local residents didn't respond. After American independence in 1783, Britain reorganized its remaining North American colonies. Quebec was divided into Upper Canada and Lower Canada, along with New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Rupert's Land, and the Columbia District. After independence, the eastern border between the U.S. and Britain roughly followed the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, which remains the eastern border between Canada and the U.S. today. In 1812, while Britain was busy with continental wars in Europe, the U.S. declared war and targeted Britain's North American colony, Canada. Facing the American invasion, Canadian and British forces fought back fiercely. The U.S. was never able to occupy Canada, and Washington, D.C. was even captured. The burning of the capital city put an end to America's plans to take Canada. In 1814, the U.S. and Britain signed the Treaty of Ghent, restoring the eastern boundary to its pre-war state. After this failed northern expansion, the U.S. decided to push westward and southward instead. In 1818, Britain and the U.S. signed a treaty establishing the 49th parallel as their western border, though this didn't include the Columbia District. From 1783 to 1848, the U.S. gradually expanded its territory from the original 13 states on the Atlantic coast all the way to the Pacific coast. To better manage defense matters against the U.S., Britain merged Upper and Lower Canada into the Province of Canada in 1840, establishing a responsible government, a crucial step toward Canadian self-governance. The 1849 Oregon Treaty between Britain and the U.S. officially set the 49th parallel as the boundary in the Columbia River region. To emphasize that the territory north of the 49th parallel belonged to Britain, the British added the word British to the region's name, creating British Columbia. At this point, Britain's North American colonies included Canada, New Brunswick, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, and the Northwest Territories, though these regions weren't unified under a single administration. Among Britain's North American colonies, the earlier developed eastern regions had larger populations and more prosperous economies. The vast Western Territories were sparsely populated, almost uninhabited. The Western region, including the Northwest Territories, covered about 7.7 million square kilometers and was managed by colonial companies focused on settlement and fur trade, such as the Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company. These two companies actually merged in 1821 to manage the territory together. To counter American threats, on July 1, 1867, Britain merged the Province of Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia into the unified Canadian Confederation, granting them status as a self-governing dominion. the first such dominion in the British Empire. At this point, Canada only included 4 provinces in the eastern seaboard and Great Lakes region, about 1/8 of today's Canada. The vast northwestern region and British Columbia, being less developed and sparsely populated, remained British colonies. Just as Canada gained self-governance, the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, gaining control of most of North America's west coast. In the 1850s and 1860s, North America's population was mainly concentrated on the east and west coasts, with the interior being largely uninhabited and desolate. However, the discovery of gold on North America's west coast in the 1850s changed everything, bringing many immigrants and even Americans to British Columbia in search of gold. When Canada first became self-governing, British Columbia was in the midst of a gold rush, experiencing a population boom. Between 1858 and 1862, about 60,000 immigrants arrived in the region. Many were Americans, and since the area was far from Britain, the US dollar was more commonly used than the British pound. These immigrants established 2 settlements on Vancouver Island, Vancouver Island itself and Fort Victoria. Fort Victoria became British Columbia's administrative center and was the predecessor of today's Vancouver. To accommodate the flood of gold seekers, the British Columbia government took on debt to build infrastructure. The economy flourished between 1858 and 1867, making it second only to the Canadian Dominion among British North American colonies. In Canada's early days as a Dominion, the Hudson's Bay Company's fur trade was increasingly pressured by American competition, and its profits kept declining. The company could no longer manage the vast North American Northwest region. To further support Canada against the U.S., Britain wanted to transfer the Hudson's Bay Company's controlled Rupert's Land and Northwest Territories to Canada. In 1869, the Hudson's Bay Company sold Rupert's Land to Canada for £300,000. This further expanded Canadian territory, with Rupert's Land and the Northwest Territories becoming the 5th region to join Canada. Canada now controlled 3/4 of its current territory, though it still didn't include the relatively prosperous Pacific Coast region of British Columbia. By 1867, British Columbia's gold rush was ending. In 1869, the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad was completed, increasing ship traffic between British Columbia and San Francisco. From San Francisco, people could take the American Pacific Railroad directly to the eastern U.S. In the 1870s, Britain discovered larger gold deposits in Australia than on North America's west coast. As the gold rush faded, many immigrants left British Columbia. By 1870, British Columbia's population had dropped to 36,000, nearly 30% lower than in 1861. The capital, Victoria, had fewer than 6,000 residents. This mass exodus left much of British Columbia's infrastructure unused. The government, which had borrowed heavily to develop inland areas, now couldn't repay its massive debt. With a sparse population and mounting debt, British Columbia became a burden in Britain's eyes. The region lacked enough people to become an independent nation. During the gold rush, Americans had made up 80% of British Columbia's immigrant population, leading some British colonial officials to view it as essentially an American satellite. They thought joining the U.S. was inevitable. Consequently, Britain gave British Columbia 2 choices: join the United States or join Canada. In 1870, the United States had just emerged from its Civil War, achieved national unity, and was becoming industrialized. It had a massive population of over 38 million. While Canada's territory was expanding, its population was small, just 3.8 million, 1/10 of the U.S. population. Moreover, Canada's population was concentrated in the eastern region. The U.S. was clearly stronger than Canada in both population and economic power. After the U.S. purchased Alaska in 1867, it controlled almost all of North America's west coast. British Columbia's coastline separated Alaska from the rest of the United States, making British Columbia extremely desirable to America. Before the gold rush, American immigrants made up a huge portion of British Columbia's foreign population, making its incorporation into the U.S. seem almost certain. President Grant proposed 2 options. First, helping British Columbia clear its debt, and second, establishing steamship routes between British Columbia and the U.S., along with infrastructure development. The U.S. hoped these measures would convince British Columbia to join them. If British Columbia joined the U.S., Alaska would be connected to the rest of America, effectively cutting off Canada's access to the Pacific Ocean. Canada also saw British Columbia as crucial. To protect Western Canada and prevent British Columbia from joining the U.S., Canada's first Governor-General Macdonald proposed two plans, encouraging Eastern Canadians to move west to increase the population, and building a Pacific Railway, the Canadian Pacific Railway, from Montreal to the Pacific coast. At the time, British Columbia had only 38,000 people, while Eastern Canada had over 3.8 million. British Columbia was relatively isolated, with cities mainly concentrated around Vancouver Island, lacking direct transportation links to North America's interior. While Canada's proposal to build the Canadian Pacific Railway couldn't immediately solve local debt problems, it would connect British Columbia to the prosperous eastern cities of Toronto and Montreal. Under the American proposal, the journey from Victoria to the North American East Coast would take at least 24 days. The Canadian Pacific Railway would provide direct land access to the economically important Great Lakes region, cutting travel time by at least 10 days. Therefore, Canada's infrastructure proposal was more appealing. After weighing the pros and cons, the local parliament decided the American proposal didn't serve their long-term interests. Canada was a British dominion, and joining Canada was another way to maintain future ties with Britain. In 1871, after extensive debate, the British Columbia Parliament decided to join the Canadian Confederation. This gave Canada a Pacific coastline, making it a country spanning 3 oceans. By 1881, after 10 years of difficult construction, the first section of the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed, running from Montreal to Alberta in Western Canada. In 1885, the western section was finished, with Vancouver Island's coal harbor chosen as the western terminus. Many railway workers settled in Vancouver. Unlike other Canadian cities that face severe winters, Vancouver on Canada's west coast stays relatively mild due to the Alaska Current, with temperatures around freezing point. The coastal areas rarely get snow, and Vancouver's location in a protected harbor makes it ideal for port development. The Canadian Pacific Railway brought new opportunities to Vancouver. Starting from its establishment in 1886, Vancouver developed a modern transportation system. The city capitalized on its harbor advantages to develop ocean shipping. Today, the Port of Vancouver has become Canada's largest port. Additionally, by developing film production and biotechnology, Vancouver has become one of Canada's crown jewels.